You probably think we dress down at school every single day, but we don't. I promise, we don't. I wish we did. But it just so happened that that's where we're at. I'm gonna wait till these bells stop ringing. 10 bells. So last time when I left you with a cliffhanger, which it was just kind of a joke because you could easily have just gone ahead and read the Bible and find out if, Jacob dies, which I'm pretty sure he doesn't because he still has a lot of stuff to do, right? So we find out that they've run away, he and his 4 wives, and their 11 sons and 1 daughter, who nobody ever heard of before, named Dinah. Benjamin is not, and thank you for coming back again, just before I forget to say that. Benjamin is not born yet, so there's 11 sons. Joseph is currently the youngest, and they ran away from his father-in-law's house because of just a lot of conflict that was building between him and his sons with Jacob and his family. And they went out and he chased him down and found them and kind of like fought with them for a while. And then they decide to amicably part ways. And we feel like everything's kind of in a good place. And then he finds out that his brother, Esau, who he had swindled out of all of his his birthright and his blessing and everything was coming. That was the cliffhanger. What happens now? There's 1 man, 4 women, and a bunch of little kids versus his brother and an army of 400 men. So the odds are stacked against him if you think about it. So he has to kind of hope that a lot of years have passed. He has to hope that the years have softened his brother's heart to him. And what does he do? He assumes the worst, and he thinks we're all going to get killed tomorrow. So what do you do at that point when you hit rock bottom, or at least you start praying? That's what usually happens. And that's exactly what he did. He separated himself from his family for the night. He went out, and that night, in the wilderness by himself, an angel of the Lord appeared to him. It just as a man, but we know that it's an angel of the Lord. And he wrestles with this man all night long. There's a wrestling match that goes on for hours and hours, and neither one could win. So that's saying something about Jacob. He's wrestling with full strength. He's got a lot of strength here. And I always say, and it's not supported in the scriptures, but in my estimation, he's wrestling with his own conscience, really, because he's thinking about, his mistakes. And that's okay. Like, reflect. At the end of the day, I think one of the greatest things we could do is just reflect on the day. What am I proud of today? What am I not proud of today? And then tomorrow, you think about that. And hopefully God gives you that good memory to not make those same mistakes again. An examination of conscience at the end of the day, And I think he was wrestling with his own heart, his own conscience. He knows that he's been through a lot since then. He's not a bad guy. I mean, he had a vision for his life, and he wanted it, and he went for it. And he had sent gifts to his brother. Like, he sent him a whole bunch of things, just hoping and keeping his fingers crossed that everything would be okay. And he'll find out the next morning. The angel said, "Let me go." Literally, Jacob won't let him go. He's got him in a half Nelson or whatever one of those moves would be, right? A full Nelson. And Jacob says, "Bless me and I will let you go." And he blesses him and he changes his name. He says, "Your name will now be Israel." So a lot of times we think of Israel as a place, right? It's a country, the country of Israel. It's the Jewish country of the Jewish people. But Israel was actually, before it was a place or a country or a nation, it was a person. Israel is his new name. Jacob is now Israel. So sometimes when we say Israel now, we're going to mean the person. Most of the time, still for a while, we're going to mean the person. Okay? It won't be called Israel as a nation for a while. And it means he who strives with God. So he wrestled with God all night long. So the next day comes, and now is the moment of truth. And here he is. He can't run away from this army of 400 men. He has to face the music. And so that's what happens. They meet across this really large plain of a field. And what does he do? He goes by himself. He keeps his family as safe as possible in the background. And he approaches his brother. He begins to approach across this field. And I love this scene in my own mind. My imagination kind of runs wild. And it says he bows literally to the ground 7 times. He bows, and he gets up and he walks a little bit more, and he bows. And after 7 times that he bows to his brother, showing that he's submitting to him, and he knows that this is his apology, essentially, right? His brother runs to him. So it's like the prodigal son story, if you remember that story. The father was watching for his sons on the horizon, and he ran to his son to show, welcome back, I forgive you, right? And that is a parallel to what happened in this field, because he runs across the field to his brother, he embraces him, and he kisses him, just like in Luke chapter 15, the prodigal son story. He embraces him, and he kisses him. So he knows that he's been forgiven. In Genesis chapter 35, God renews his commitment to this family, and he says to them something that he says again and again. He said it to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. He said it to Noah and his wife and kids and their wives, be fruitful and multiply. Be fruitful and multiply. This marks another new creation. This is the third creation, essentially. This time not with Adam and Eve, nor with the 3 sons of Noah, but with the 12 sons of Jacob, or the 12 tribes of Israel is who it's going to be later, right? I need to go back and read you something that is interesting, and this might be an aha moment for many of us. After Sarah died, so Abraham and Sarah, where we started, the person that we started with, after she died, Abraham, according to Genesis chapter 15, took another wife. And nobody knows this because we skip a lot of stuff when we're growing up in the Bible. And her name was Keturah. I actually went to college with a girl named Keturah, and I found out later that she was named after Abraham's second wife. And she bore him 6 sons. She bore him 6 more sons. And one of them is going to be called Midian. And that's going to be important later. So just remember that. And I just say that because nobody knows about this lady. Nobody knows that he had more kids. So he has Ishmael with Hagar. He has Isaac with Sarah. And he has 6 more children with this woman named Keturah, who came much later. Okay? Then Abraham dies, which we've already talked about. So now we're back on track. Of the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob, same thing basically. The one that we're going to be concerned with in the long run is the 4th son, Judah. Judah is the tribe that Jesus comes from, the direct line. But the more famous brother is called Joseph. We're going to talk about him for a while. And so most of us are familiar more with his story than Judah's story, but I'm going to catch us up on Judah's part in this and why he's important. And the story from the last chapters of Genesis 38 to 50 focusing on Joseph, this character that most of us know about. In fact, I'm doing a show right now at Cathedral Prep, which is our spring musical, and it's called Andrew Lloyd Webber's Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, because it just happens to be our show this year, and we have rehearsal after school today. So like his New Testament counterpart, Joseph, Saint Joseph, is that Saint Joseph? I don't know where Saint Joseph is, but anyway, he's around here somewhere, yeah. Like him, this Joseph also has dreams. And if you remember, Joseph in the Gospel of Matthew has 4 or 5 dreams that always keep him on track: to take Mary as his wife, to flee when King Herod's trying to kill all the boys, the little baby boys in Bethlehem. When he comes back from Egypt, it's safe to come back, etc., etc. This Old Testament counterpart has dreams as well, his famous dreams. Let me catch myself up here in my Bible. And his story actually begins in chapter 37. And I'll read you a little bit of that. Jacob settled in the land where his father had sojourned, the land of Canaan. It's still called the land of Canaan. This is the story of Jacob's family. And again, this, you might be like, yeah, I've read this story. That's okay. It's a good just reminder. When Joseph was 17 years old, he was tending the flocks with his brothers. Joseph brought their father bad reports about the brothers. He doesn't make good choices. He doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut, is really what it all boils down to. Jacob, or Israel, loved Joseph best of all of his sons, for he was the child of his old age, and he made for him a long ornamented tunic, which we call the Technicolor Dreamcoat. When his brothers saw that their father loved him best of all his brothers, they hated him so much that they could not even talk to him. Once, Joseph had a dream which he told his brothers, and they made him hate him even more. He said, "Listen to this dream I had." He said, there we were binding sheaves in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose to an upright position, and all of yours formed a ring around mine and bowed to it. What's going to make them happy about that, right? They said, "Are you really going to make yourself a king over us?" Because remember, he's the baby brother. You know, there's no way that he would be ever like the first. There's too many other brothers that are older, right? So they hated him all the more because of his dreams and his bad reports about them. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Again, some things are better left unsaid, right? "Look, I had another dream," he said. "This time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." So if the 11 stars are the brothers, right, because Benjamin's born by now, who are the sun and the moon? His mother and father, right? Well, his mother's dead, but the dad gets wind of this, and he says, "Wait a minute, what? I'm bowing down to you too? Can it be that your mother and your brothers are to come and bow to the ground before you?" So now once Jacob has some skin in the game, he doesn't like it either. So his brothers were furious at him, but his father kept the matter in mind. One day, when his brothers had gone to pasture their flocks at Shechem, Jacob, or Israel, said to Joseph, "I'm sending you to your brothers." When he came and looked for them, I'm going to skip down a little bit, they said, "Here he comes, that dreamer. Let us kill him and throw him into the cistern here, and we could say that a wild beast devoured him. We'll see what comes of his dreams then," right? He'll be dead. When Reuben, the oldest heard this, he tried to save him, saying, "We must not take his life." Reuben said, "Do not shed blood. Throw him into the cistern in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him." He was going to come back later and rescue him when the others didn't know about it. Because he's trying to be the good oldest brother. So you got to give him some credit. So when Joseph came up to them, they stripped him of his tunic and they threw him into the cistern. And then they sat down and had lunch, which always bugged me. Like, how can you eat when you just threw your brother into this well and you're going to let him die in there? And they can still eat. You know, they don't really, I don't know, I don't like that. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. So remember, Ishmael would have been their great uncle. The Ishmaelites would be their somehow kind of half Egyptian relatives. They had camels and all kind of things in a big caravan, and they were going to Egypt. The fourth brother, Judah, says, he's our direct line to Jesus. "What is to be gained by killing him and concealing his blood? Let us sell him to them." So one of his brothers decided to sell him, and they sold him for 20 pieces of silver.
and the Ishmaelites took him down to Egypt. When Reuben went back to the cistern and he saw that his brother was not in there, he returned and said, he's not there anymore. They took his coat and they slaughtered a goat and they dipped it in its blood. And then they went back and told their father that he had been killed by a wild beast. A lot of this, I think you know. So the tattletale brother, they're shepherds. Remember that too. Abraham was a shepherd. Isaac was a shepherd. Jacob and his sons are shepherds. Jesus will be a shepherd later on. King David will also be a shepherd. So the slave traders took them. And there's Joseph, what we call a type for Christ. And so when we find a lot of parallels between different people's lives, we call that typology. So a type means there's parallels between Joseph, and the most obvious would be Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, or one of his brothers, if you will, and sold for 20 pieces of silver. Jesus was betrayed by Judas, one of his, quote, brothers or apostles, and was sold for 30 pieces of silver. So again, it's not exactly the same, but it's two stories that you can't help but see like, oh, right? Oh, okay. So we'll get more of this later, especially when we get to Moses. But we just want to remember that Reuben, the oldest, the firstborn, and Judah, the fourthborn, also try to save him somehow. Those two are going to be, of all of the 11. And Benjamin's not really part of this. He's the youngest brother. I think he's just a very, very small child at this point. He wouldn't be culpable for any of these things that they did to their brother. Plus, he's Joseph's only full-blooded brother because they're the only ones who came from Jacob's wife, Rachel, who was his favorite wife. And unfortunately, she died in childbirth with Benjamin. And she was buried on the road off of the road outside of Bethlehem. So we have a connection to Bethlehem already thousands of years before. We're tied to this place, right? We're tied to this place. So Joseph is sold as a slave and taken down to Egypt, where he is purchased by Potiphar and his wife. Joseph always, though, seems to rise to the top. His only fault really is that he doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut. I mean, he's good otherwise. And everywhere he goes, he's successful. So he becomes the head of this guy's whole household, this gigantic rich guy's house. Everything that Joseph does, God blesses him. Everything, right? He's strikingly, quote, strikingly handsome in countenance and in body. So he's fit and good looking. And I'm going to skip over to chapter 39 here, and we're going to see what happens. Sometimes being good looking is not good. So chapter 39, verse 7, I'll start with. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. After a time, his master's wife looked with longing upon him, so she was lusting after him. Lie with me, she said. But he refused. He said, my master is so good to me. He entrusts me to everything he owns. He's put me in charge of everything. How could I do this to him? Joseph's a good guy. He's not going to have adultery with her. And he would not agree to lie with her. But she persisted and persisted and persisted. And once she grabbed a hold of him and he got away. And then she got nervous thinking, I have his cloak and he ran away half naked. What's this going to look like? So I'm going to say that he tried to rape me, right? To make a long story short. And they believe her, and says Joseph's master seized him and put him in jail where the king's prisoners were confined. And there he sat in jail. However, listen to this. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him kindness by making the chief jailer well disposed towards him. So then the chief jailer puts Joseph in charge of all the prisoners. So again, he rises all the time to the top. He's always rising to the top. No matter what they throw at him, he rises to the top and brings success, it says, to everything he does. So then we come to a very important chapter. And I want you to just listen to this story. Because I think even if you're aware of this story, there's some things that I think there's an aha moment or two coming. Where we're going to compare Jesus' life to this guy's life. Sometime afterward, the royal cupbearer, okay, and the baker offended the king of Egypt. The cupbearer and the baker, okay? So cup filled with wine, baker baking bread and wine, right? Bread and wine. That Melchizedek brought when we talked about him last time. Melchizedek, that strange priest king from Bethlehem, or from Jerusalem, the Prince of Peace, King of Peace, whatever, bread and wine. So you kind of have to look below the surface and say, wait a minute. Pharaoh was angry with these two officials, the chief baker and the chief cupbearer. He put them in prison where Joseph was. And he assigned Joseph to them, and he became their attendant, and they were in custody for some time. And they both had dreams that they say, can you help us understand what's going on here? And he says, yeah, my dreams do come true. My interpretations are always correct. So if you want me to do this for you, I will do this for you. The cupbearer came first and said, in my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches, 3, very important number in the Bible, and it had barely budded when its blossoms came out and the clusters ripened into grapes, and Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. So I took the grapes and pressed them into wine and gave them to the Pharaoh. And Joseph said, the 3 branches are 3 days. 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will single you out and give you back your job again. You're going to be fine. You will be for him what you were before. You will your former job is going to be your job again. All right? But he says, remember me when you get out. Remember that I'm in here. Right? He's a good guy, and everybody knows it. And he says, the truth was that I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and et cetera, et cetera. Then the baker steps forward. His story is not as happy. And he said, I too had a dream. I had 3 bread baskets on my head, and all of them had baked bread basically in them. And I had them made for Pharaoh, but the birds came and ate them. And Joseph said, the 3 baskets are 3 days. And unfortunately, within 3 days, you will be impaled on a stake, which is probably one of the most horrific things you could ever imagine happening to a person, right? Just being pushed on a stake, right? And dying, hanging there and dying there on that stake of wood, right? And sure enough, that's what happened. But think about this. So let's compare. Bread and wine, so we know that. We're going to tie that into the Eucharist. We're going to tie this into the Paschal Mystery, which we're going to celebrate on Holy Thursday, Good Friday. Where are they at? They're in prison. Joseph is between 2 prisoners, like Jesus was crucified between 2 prisoners, right? One was, we say, saved at the last second, right? Remember, he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Today you will be with me in paradise. You're going to be okay. You're going to live forever. The other one, right? The other prisoner doesn't. He rebukes Jesus, and he is not saved. He is not saved. And unfortunately, that butler forgot Jesus. And I want to mention this too. I've mentioned this before. The most significant characters in the Bible often are people who are what I call a man between 2 worlds. Joseph is one of those people because he's Hebrew, Jewish, but now he's lived in Egypt for a considerable amount of time, And when he gets out of prison, eventually, he's going to become a high-ranking Egyptian person. So who better to kind of be able to always bring groups together than someone who understands literally both of the worlds where people are coming from, right? And so the dreams, Joseph is still stuck in there for a while until chapter 41. Pharaoh has dreams that are disturbing him too. And I'll read this to you. It's Pharaoh, so the baker is dead and the butler is alive, but the butler forgets to tell anybody about Joseph until the Pharaoh needs some dreams interpreted. And he says, Pharaoh was standing by the Nile, and this was his dream. When he, up out of the Nile, because the Nile is, the life of the world, the Egyptian world. All the life came from that Nile. 7 cows, fat, came out. But behind them came out of them gaunt, poor-looking 7 more cows. Right? The poor, gaunt cows ate the 7 fat cows. And then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep. He had another dream. He saw 7 beautiful ears of corn, fat and healthy. Then behind them sprouted 7 ears of grain, then thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin swallowed up the fat, and he didn't know what this meant, right? So 7 beautiful are swallowed up by 7 ugly, gaunt. And he said, this is what this means. There's going to be 7 years of more food than you can imagine. Like, you're not going to know what to do with it all. And then there's going to be 7 years of no food, like a famine, okay? So you need to ration this food, right, during the first 7, so that during the second, you have all the food you want and you won't die, right? Down here on verse 38, it says, we need to find somebody who, who can make this happen. He's like, me. So they put Joseph in command, and he said, you will, let me see, it says, he made him second in command. He will sit at the right hand of the king. Robes of fine linen, gold chains, signet rings, everything that signifies authority are given to him. And Pharaoh even says, you will ride in my chariot. Like, you can't get any higher up than that. And he says to Joseph, no one shall move a hand or a foot in all the land without your approval. Another parallel to the life of Jesus would be that Joseph was 30 years old when he entered Pharaoh's service. And Jesus was 30 years old when his ministry began. Before that, we know very little about his life at all, right? So that's another parallel between Joseph from the Old Testament and Jesus. Everything went as expected. The world was hungry, and everybody began to hear about, they have all the food that they want down there, because for the last 7 years, this guy has rationed the food very wisely, and they have more than enough than they know what to do with. So they begin to come to him for food. He's in charge of feeding the world. And again, like, look at the Eucharistic table. We're not usually full when we're done eating here, but like the Eucharist is the bread that's all around the world right now. Like, there's masses going on all around the world as we speak this moment. There's never a moment where there's not a mass happening somewhere. The world is being fed spiritually through the Eucharist, just like the whole world becomes fed by the bread that is made from, the rationed grain. Jacob then hears about this back in Canaan, where everything is, starving to death. And Jacob sends the 10 older brothers, not the baby. We're not letting him out of our sight, because he's the only living, that he thinks, son of his favorite wife, right? And so the others go down. And I'm going to read you just the beginning of what happens next. Genesis chapter 42. We're kind of going quick through this. This is good. It's a long story, but it's a good story. The brothers, when Jacob learned that the grain rations were for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you keep looking at one another? I hear grain is on sale, for sale, and not on sale. For sale, the Egyptian, on sale. Go down there and get us some food. Bring it back here." But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin, for he thought some disaster might befall him. So off they came, and when they get there, he recognizes them, but they do not recognize him, because he's dressed now like an Egyptian. And I don't even know how many years passed of him in that prison, but it was a long time. He wasn't in there like overnight. He was there for like 7 years or 15 years or something like that. And they came down and not recognized him, but he recognized them. And they come and they bow before him. And he thinks, I saw this in my dreams, and now it's actually happening. But he didn't tell them who he was. He probably had makeup on, and he was probably tan, and he probably shaved head, because that's what the Egyptians did. They didn't like body hair. And he accuses them of being spies. And he said, "We are your servants. We are 12 brothers, sons of a certain man in Canaan. The youngest is present with our father, and the other one is no more." So they're telling him about him, that he's dead. He's no more. And he's sitting there thinking, yeah, you think I'm not anymore, but here I am in charge of everything, right? I'm literally in charge of the whole world. Like Jesus is in charge of the whole world. Like Joseph is literally in charge of the whole world. He says, "You are spies." And they say, "No, we're not. No, we're not." And he locked them up for 3 days in the guardhouse. He locks his brothers he locks them up. And then he says to them after 3 days, "All of you can go, except I'm keeping one of you here. And you need to go back, and I'll give you food, but you need to go back and bring your youngest brother, and then I'll free this second oldest brother." He took Simeon. Reuben is first, Simeon is second. Simeon is thrown into jail and not let out. And they said, that's never going to happen. I don't think our dad's ever going to let us bring our youngest brother here because he's afraid he'll die. He's afraid. And he says, "No, you got to go tell him." And he actually asked about the dad, which is interesting. And I can't read the whole thing to you. We just don't have enough time. But at some point he says, "Oh, and how is your father and your youngest brother?" He wants to know, how's my dad? Because he has been away for so long. Is he alive even? And when they go back, it never really dawns on them until Jacob says to them, "Why did you tell him? Why did you tell him that you had a younger brother?" They said, "Well, he asked about him, and he asked about our dad." And they never really, So an interesting thing happens next. Simeon is back in Egypt, in prison. And he gives them all the food they need. And they go back, and they're there for a while, and they said, "We have to take Benjamin to Egypt." And he says, "There's no way you're taking him." And they said, "Well, then Simeon is going to stay locked up there." He doesn't care that much. He only cares about the youngest. And it's only when the food runs out the second time. When the food runs out again, that first whatever they brought back, he says, "You need to go back and get some more food. And here's the money." He has plenty of money. He just doesn't have any food. And they say, he's never going to let us. We have to bring Benjamin back with us. He's never going to give us food again. And Simeon is still in prison. And he says, "All right." But he says, I'm afraid that something's going to happen to him. And this is really cool. Reuben steps forward and says, the oldest. So he's trying to be the firstborn son. He is trying his hardest to do the right thing. And he says, "If anything happens to Benjamin, you can literally take my 2 sons. He's older. You can take them and do whatever you want." So he's trying to let his dad know that nothing will happen. And then Judah steps forward and says, "I will personally," and this is so important. Reuben doesn't say this. Reuben says, "You can kill my 2 sons or have them as your sons instead of Benjamin. They can replace Benjamin and Joseph, right? You can still have 2 sons, the same amount." Judah says something else. He says, "Dad, this is so cool. I I will take his place. And that's what Jesus did for us, right, on the cross. He took our place. So his ancestor, Judah, said, Dad, Benjamin will come back. If it comes down to one or the other, I will give my life so that he can live. Right? So don't we kind of feel like Jesus' little brothers and sisters? I mean, in a way, aren't we? Yes, because as his brothers and sisters. So he told us we could call God our Father, and he took our place, just like Judah said that he would. So they go back, and everything is great, and Joseph sees Benjamin, and he's so happy to see him, but he still doesn't tell them, who he is. He still keeps that part a secret. And they notice that when he lets Simeon out of jail, they're all sitting around the table, and they notice that when the waiters come out, that Benjamin's plate is twice as much as everybody else's, the youngest brother. And then he does something that, again, many of you probably know because of the story being kind of famous. He wants to make sure that the brothers have truly changed hearts, right? He has to make sure that their hearts are not the same as they were back when they sold him into slavery. I mean, that's horrible. So he puts a goblet into the grain bag of Benjamin and hides it in there. And he says, see you later, everybody. Have a great trip back to Canaan. If you get hungry again, come on back. And they're all there. All 11 of them are off and running, but they're not even a stone throw away. They're not even a stone's throw out of the city when they're surrounded by the chariots of the Egyptian guards and dragged back into the city. And they don't know what's going on. They have no idea what's happening. And he says, one of you has stolen from me. I gave you all the food you could eat, and I was so good to you all this time. Twice I gave you food. And he even gave them their money back. It was crazy. He gave them everything. And they search through all of the bags, one by one, starting with the oldest, right? Nope. Benjamin. He found it. They're like, what? The worst scenario, our worst nightmare is coming true. Because he's going to either get killed now or in prison and not be allowed to go home, and Dad is going to kill us. Literally. And Reuben's thinking, he's going to kill my kids. And then Judah steps in and says, we have an aged father. The youngest is the only full brother of the one who is dead, at least they thought he was. Please let him go, or our father will die of grief. And then he says, let me, Judah, let me take his place. Let me take his place. And then in verses 1-5 of chapter 45, Joseph makes sense of this whole ordeal for them. Joseph could no longer restrain himself in the presence of his attendants. He made them all leave. And then he revealed himself to his brothers. Now this is going to be, this is what happened. And this is going to sound strange. He revealed himself to his brothers by showing them his circumcision, because Egyptians didn't do that. So he basically pulled his pants down and said, look, it's me. I know that sounds kind of weird, but that's why you come, right? Because you like the way I tell the story. It's funny. I make it funny. He pulled his pants down. Look, guys, do you recognize this? And they're like, Joseph, whatever. So remember, how did Jesus reveal himself to his disciples? He showed them the wounds, the cut flesh. Circumcision is cutting of the male foreskin, flesh. Jesus showed them his cut, pierced flesh. And that's how they knew it was him. So again, another parallel that the average person doesn't know, but you do, right? Now you do. He said, I am Joseph. And then he asked about his father. They're so happy. And then he said this, listen. Joseph could no longer restrain himself in the presence of his brothers. He made himself known to his brothers, but his sobs were so loud that the Egyptians heard him, and so the news reached Pharaoh's house. I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could give him no answer, so dumbfounded were they at him. Come closer to me, Joseph said to them. When they had done that, he said, I am your brother whom you sold into Egypt. But now, this is the key. Do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for having sold me here. It was really for the sake of saving lives that God sent me here ahead of you. So he said, what you did was really crappy. But I see it looking backward, as often we can look backward through the pain and through the hardship or whatever. Like we can maybe hopefully see how God was at work through all of that. And that's what he says here. God did this. God allowed this to happen, this whole series of events to happen, because it literally saved the lives of the entire world, right? Joseph was that savior of the world. And Jesus came to be the savior of the world. And what happened to him on the cross was horrible and crappy, but it saved us. So you see what I mean? Another parallel between the lives of Joseph and the life of Jesus. And then he said, go get dad and bring him here, which is so good. And they brought Jacob down, and he came to Egypt. And Joseph heard that he was near, and he couldn't wait. So he hopped on his chariot, the Pharaoh's chariot, and he flew out there as fast as he could, and he hugged his dad. And he got special permission from the Pharaoh to give his family like the best land in the entire country of Egypt called Goshen. And that's where they're going to live. They had the choicest land, the best fertile land and everything. And in chapter 49, I'll just stay here. In chapter 49, it's Jacob's last will and testament, and he singles out all of his children one by one. And the only one that we really care about at this point is Judah, because most of them, like his prophecy for them is not even that great. But this is what he says about Judah. Because remember, Judah's the one that said, I will take his place. I will step in. I give my life for them, for everybody, just like Jesus did. And this is what he says to Judah 1,000 years, before there was even a kingdom. You, Judah, fourthborn, so not normal, right? You, Judah, shall your brothers praise. Your hand on the neck of your enemies. The sons of your father will bow down to you. Judah is a lion's cub. You have grown up on prey, my son. He crouches like a lion, like a lioness who would dare rouse him. And that's why Jesus is referred to as the Lion of Judah sometimes. He's the Lamb of God and the Lion of Judah, the Lion and the Lamb. There's even a song called The Lion and the Lamb, because Jesus gave himself like a lamb, but he's the king of the jungle too. See what I mean? It's like he's the fiercest of animals and the humblest at the same time, right? He came first like a lamb in Bethlehem as a little baby. When he comes again, he comes as like a lion, like the king of everything. Got it? And this is the really important part of this, most important part of this. The scepter, the king's scepter, will never depart from Judah, this son. He will be his line, none of the others. His line will be the line of the kings. It sounds kind of like a Tolkien book, I know, the Lord of the Rings or one of those. And that's where they got all this. They got it from our Bible. This is all the inspiration for the Harry Potter books and the Star Wars movies. And this is where it all comes from. The scepter shall never depart from Judah, the mace from between his feet, until tribute comes from him and receives the people's obedience. He tethers his donkey to the vine, the donkey's foal to the choicest stem. In wine he washes his garments, like the water and like the blood of Jesus washing our garments. in like his robe in the blood of the grapes. Okay? So that's a prophecy about Jesus coming eventually through the line of Judah. And that's why I think this is really, really very important. In the verses that follow, Jacob dies, and his brothers get really nervous because they think, well, now that Dad's dead, is he going to change his mind and kill us all, right? Except for Benjamin. They flung themselves upon their father, and they wept over him. They embalmed him for 40 days, not surprising, and they mourned for him for 70 days. So again, very biblically perfect numbers. And then they took him back to Canaan and buried him there. They buried him in the cave where Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah are buried, and where eventually Jacob and Leah will be buried together. The last chapter of this book of the Bible, this first book of the Bible, chapter 50, verses 15, I'm going to read to you. They pled with him because of the wrong that they had done. And Joseph said to them, before your father died, he gave us this instruction. They said, he gave us this instruction. You shall say, forgive our wrongdoing, just to be sure that he was really, really sorry. They were sorry. We are your slaves. He said, do not fear. Like I mean you no harm. And he said, just do this for me. I'm going to read you the last 3 lines of the book of Genesis. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die. God will surely take care of you and lead you up from this land to the promise, on the promise he made to Abraham, Isaac, and our father. Then putting the sons of Israel under oath, he said, I love this. When God takes care of you and takes you back to the land that you're going to eventually inherit again, you must bring my bones up from this place. Do not leave me here, even though Egypt's been good to him overall. But he said, take my bones and take me home. Literally, I don't want to be buried here, right? And that's the taking of the bones to the promised land. You know, it's like the dry bones coming back to life. It's like us coming back from the dead, going to the promised land of heaven, body and soul, our bones and our flesh and our spirits. Joseph died at 110 years old. He was embalmed and laid to rest in a coffin in Egypt. So that's kind of where we are. So 400 years will pass. When they went down, it says very, very clearly at the beginning of the book of Exodus, which is where we're at, that's where we're situated right now, said 70 people, including Jacob, went down to Egypt. 70, a perfect number. And 400 years later, they're going to go back out. Many, many, many more, of course. I mean, like tens of thousands are going to leave because a lot happens in 400 years. But listen to these parallels that I kind of mentioned already. Joseph and Jesus, both are the Father's beloved Son. Jesus is called, this is my beloved Son. God says at his baptism and at the transfiguration that we just heard like a week and a half ago at Mass, this is my beloved Son. Listen to what he says. The Father's beloved Son, Joseph. No one will move unless you tell them to. Listen to him, the Pharaoh says, right? Both are hated and despised. Jesus by the Jewish people, Joseph by his brothers, the fathers of the Jewish people. They are the original 12 Jews. Right there, right? Abraham, Isaac, this family. They were the 12 tribes, right? This is their family. Both are humiliated. Jesus on the cross, certainly Joseph. Betrayed by brothers, sold for silver. Both resisted temptation. Remember, three Sundays ago, Jesus out in the desert resisted the temptations of the devil. Joseph resisted the temptations of Mrs. Potiphar, we call her, right? The lady. Both fed the world, one with bread and one with Eucharistic bread. Both ended up at the right hand of the king. Joseph next to the Pharaoh. We say Jesus is seated now at the right hand of the Father. Both were not recognized by their own people, right? His brothers didn't recognize him, and Jesus' Jewish brothers and sisters, the people of his time did not recognize him except for a few. Both were sentenced with two criminals. One ended up saved, and one was lost, just like Jesus on the cross, in between the good thief and the bad thief. And both forgave those who wronged them, right? Both forgave those who wronged them. So with that, we still have about 20 minutes or so, and I hope that I'm going to keep going if that's okay with you guys. Next, we skip to the next period. So the patriarchal period has now come to an official close. And now we enter the period called the Egyptian period. Okay, and the Egyptian period lasts for 400 years that we just really hear referenced, but it also includes the 40 odd years, or 40 years, let's just say, out in the desert. Okay, 70 people, a symbolic number, of course, of Jacob and his wives and their children and their grandchildren go down to Egypt. They multiplied and grew there and became exceedingly strong. And I would imagine that we're walking into, if we haven't already been, some very familiar waters, right? There's movies made about this. They lived in Goshen, the best place of all. They prospered, but it was not God's will that they were going to stay there forever. So something has to happen to get them, to light a fire under them, to get out of there, right? And because the land that they're supposed to inherit is over there. It's not where you're at. Even though you're in the choice land, your land is called Canaan, and eventually it'll be called Israel, and it's back home. So we're not really sure what happened after 400 years, but a new Pharaoh came, and it says in the book of Exodus, he did not know anything about Joseph or his family or how he saved the world or any of that. And so the friendship is over between the Israelites and the Egyptian people. And this new king or Pharaoh uses some fear tactics, propaganda type things, to get them to be afraid of the Israelites because they were so powerful. And they're called the Hebrews at this point. A lot of it is called the Hebrews, and there are many of them. That's the name that they have been. That's how they go. That's what they go by now. The Hebrew children, the Hebrew midwives, whatever. And there's so many of them. And he says, well, how about if they decide that they want to take us over? They could just take us over like that, right? And he said to the midwives, he's enslaved them somehow. We don't know how this happened, but somehow they become enslaved and they're working very hard. And again, you know this story. But you might not know this part. He said to the midwives who delivered the babies of the Hebrew people, he said, if a girl is born, she can live. But if a boy is born, you kill the boy, throw him into the river. And the midwives don't do that, of course. They're not going to kill babies, right? That's not their job. Their job is to deliver babies. And the Pharaoh ends up having a parallel with King Herod, who killed all the little boys under 2 years old in Bethlehem and the surrounding area. He's a parallel to this Old Testament king. And they said, by the time we get there, those Hebrew women, boy, they pop them right out, and they're already born. So it's too late. It's too late to throw them. It's too late to kill them right there, like they would ever do that anyway. And it says, so God blessed the midwives who said, no, we're not killing babies. So here's an interesting thing. And again, it doesn't all make sense. Like logically even, I wrestle with this, but why not the females? Why kill just the males? And the answer is that if there's only female Hebrews, they're going to want to get married. So who are they going to marry but Egyptian men? And then the land rights in Goshen revert back to the Egyptians, like one married couple at a time. But you wonder, do they really own the land if they're slaves? How does that work? That's the part that I can't really figure out, and I just haven't really had time to think about, even after years and years of teaching this. It does make sense, though. So all the Hebrew girls marry Egyptian guys. The guys end up owning all the land, and eventually we can get all the land back. And of course, the sad reality is that some of the boys are killed, many of them, but one in particular, baby, was successfully hidden, and that's Moses. He's our next big guy that we're going to talk about. And again, his story should be pretty familiar to you. And I'm going to hope to tell you some things that you don't know about him over the next little while. And he's another man between two worlds. So think about this. There's a parallel. In Noah's time, Noah was told to build an ark, which was a box, a giant kind of a box. I know. We think of it as being like a ship. It's kind of like a box. It's rectangular. And it floats. And it floats because they put bitumen and pitch in between. That's what it says, very carefully. Bitumen and pitch, like tar and stuff, right? To make it waterproof so that all the life inside of there, all the hope for the new creation that's dwelling in that floating gigantic box, like, probably 10 times as big as this church, all is kept safe. The only other time in the Bible that it says bitumen and pitch are used to make something waterproof is the basket that Moses is put inside of on the water, like the ark, the waters of the flood, the waters of the Nile. He's put inside there, covered, closed up, bitumen and pitch, so he doesn't drown, so it doesn't sink. Because why? He's the hope. All the hope rests in him. He's the one baby in the plan that can do this, right? And so there's that ark parallel with Noah's ark, and the bitumen and the pitch are that tell. How we go, oh my gosh, that's the only other place in the Bible that that's used. And this is a really good story about women. The women are the heroes of this story. The midwives refuse to kill the babies. Moses' mother is smart enough to hide her child, lucky enough, whatever, and then decides to devise a plan to get him into safety. And so she puts him in that, she creates this safe thing for him to go inside of, right? And then sends his sister, Miriam, to watch where it goes and kind of make sure that it goes in the right direction. And he ends up floating right up to Pharaoh's daughter's house or whatever, where she's taking a bath, right, in the river. So we have the midwives, we have Moses' mother, we have Moses' sister, and now we have Pharaoh's daughter, right? And she's not going to kill this baby. She's going to adopt this baby. But she didn't have a baby, so she can't nurse the baby. So the little girl says, oh, excuse me, you know what? I know the lady who just gave birth, and it's like, she'd be happy to nurse this child for you. Guess who they got? His own mom, which is cool. And that begins to show how Moses is going to become another one of these a man between two worlds. Because his mother, they nursed their babies for a long time back then, right? A lot longer than maybe today. So he was raised in the house of the Egyptian Pharaoh, with Pharaoh's daughter as his mother, but he was nursed and taught by his own Jewish Hebrew mother for years. So he knew both sides of the story. And that's going to come to a choice at some point. What do I do? Who do I identify with? I identify with this group, the richest people in the world, that I live in their house, and I'm their adopted son. I'm a son of the Egyptians. Or do I identify with the poorest people in the world, who are my biological parents, right? He had everything in the world, but he was also able to understand the other side of the story. The pain, the suffering, the tears, right? The sadness. And he begins to not like how the Jewish people are being treated by the Egyptian people. And he's 40 years old. 40, again, it's coming up many times. 40, 40, 40, 40, 40. One day, he snapped. And he snapped on an Egyptian soldier who was beating a Hebrew slave. And in that, fight, whatever that looks like. The details are not clear. The Egyptian beating that slave is killed in the process. Moses kills him, or he accidentally dies somehow. And so Moses is clearly shifting. He's definitely taking on beginning to really reflect the side of the poor people, right, the slaves. He's rather share their ill treatment with the people of God than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of the sinful side of the family. But he's still scared. He's a human being still. So he hides the body of the Egyptian in the sand, but it's found out, and because of that, he becomes a wanted man somehow. And fearing for his life, he flees to Egypt. And he goes, and this is why I read you the 6 names of the children of Keturah, Abraham and Keturah. One of their children was named Midian. And remember, everybody in the Bible becomes like a place eventually. Like you become the place that you live ends up being named after you after 400 years, right? And so when he runs out of Egypt and he flees to Midian, so they have Jewish connections, right? There's a priest there called Jethro, and Jethro is a Midianite priest who basically are worshiping the same God because they have Abraham, the first Jewish person, in their history. He's just not the child or the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchild of Abraham and Sarah. He's the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchild of Abraham and Keturah, his second wife, right? But they're still connected. They're worshiping the same God. The God of Israel is also the God of the Midianites, okay? Descendants of Abraham. Now, this might have been the end of the story because he gets married to Jethro's daughter Zipporah, and they have a child. I don't remember if they have 1 or 2 children actually at this moment. I know he has at least. Oh, he has at least a couple children. I think he has 2. But anyway, the 2 of them have a child, and he is a shepherd. And what does the backdrop of his life look like? It's Mount Sinai and this beautiful mountain range. He lives in this gorgeous area. He's far, far from all the crazy Egyptian crap, life, all of that stuff. And 40 more years pass. And a lot of people don't realize that. We think Moses would be like 40 when he went to Egypt again. He was actually 80 by then, right? Everybody lived a lot longer. And he was, of course, as a profession, a shepherd, right? So the prince of Egypt becomes the shepherd out in the wilderness, right? At the base of Mount Sinai. And he did not want to go back, really. He may have forgotten the troubles of the people back there because his life looked pretty darn good and very peaceful and relaxing and shepherding sheep in the wilderness, right? What's called the Mountain of God, Sinai or Mount Horeb, same place. It's called the Mountain of God. And then one day, God shakes his life up, right? And we know the story. He sees the burning bush. He sees a bush that's consumed. It's on fire, but it's not consumed. Sorry, it's surrounded by fire, but not consumed. And I always parallel this with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. When it said they were naked, but they didn't know it. Well, what were they? I always say and I heard this from a rabbi once. They were wearing garments of light. Garments of light that were stripped from them when they sinned. So they were kind of surrounded by God's fire, like the burning bush. But they were not consumed by it because, of course, they weren't, just like the burning bush wasn't being consumed. And here is where God speaks to Moses for the very first time. And he's very specific. He says, "Who are you?" Because he's thinking like, Moses doesn't know that there's necessarily just one God. He was raised in a family that worshiped the one God, but after 400 years, they couldn't really tell him that much because there's so much time had passed. Like, well, we do worship the Lord, but we don't know much about him because we've been in this slavery situation for 400 years. And on the other side, they're worshiping everything: cats, dogs, sheep, oxen, goats, you name it. The Egyptians have a god for everything, right? All animals. They worship frogs and weird things, right? who are you? And he said, I am the God, and he's very specific. I am the God of Abraham. Now, if he had stopped there, I am the God of Abraham. Oh, well, I know Abraham's somewhere in my family tree, right? But the God of Abraham is Ishmael was half Egyptian, right? He didn't stop there. It's too vague. I'm the God of Abraham, meaning could be the God of the Ishmaelites who, sold Joseph, they sold Joseph to. Nope. And the God of Isaac. Okay, now we're narrowing the family tree. But Isaac also had a brother, remember? Isaac also had a half-brother, Ishmael. Wait a minute. Abraham, Isaac, not Ishmael, the Egyptian, and Jacob, but not Esau. Because Esau's people became the Edomites. They were worshiping other gods kind of by this point. He says, I am the God of these three people. In other words, I am the God of the people who are enslaved in Egypt. I am their God, the slaves. I am the God of the slaves. And God told Moses that he would free those slaves through him and bring them to a land all their own. And he was going to be the person through whom this happens, right? And the land that I promised to Abraham, and then his son, and then his son, and then the 12 brothers who Moses comes from. Moses, incidentally, does anybody know who his brother, of the 12 brothers, his is the third brother? Reuben, Simeon, Levi. Moses is a Levite, who are the tribe of the priests. Then Judah, the tribe of the kings. Not the same. You can't be both. So this is gigantic, big news, and drum roll, please. You will be the one that make this happen. And he tries everything that he can to get out of it. God promises him that I'll be with you the whole time, but Moses said, I don't want to. I literally don't want to be this guy. I don't want to go back there. I don't know after 40 years if anybody remembers me or not, but if they do, I left there as a fugitive. I'm a bad speaker. He said, no problem, I'll send you. You have a brother back there named Aaron, and he's a good speaker, so I'll hook you up together, and he can do the talking. And then he said, but I'm not a good leader. He said, you will be, because I will give you what you need. If I'm going to call you to this vocation, you're going to be okay. And I think that's what God would say to all of us. Whatever he wants to call you to, he'll give you the grace and strength to get to do what he wants, right? Or else he wouldn't call you to that. That would be cruel. The message to Pharaoh from God through Moses is this. This is really important. Israel, meaning this entire nation of people who you have enslaved, is my firstborn son. In other words, this also means that Israel, this nation of people enslaved, is the older brother of all the other nations of the world. And so as the firstborn son, you have particular responsibilities. This nation that you have enslaved has been chosen by me to show you all the rest of the nations how to live as my people. They are to understand who God is and then radiate that out with all the other nations of the world. The other nations, including Egypt, and they're not going to like this. Egypt and the other nations of the world, the Midianites, the Edomites, the whoever, are the younger sons and daughters. They're the younger siblings, and that's going to be offensive to them. They are the younger siblings. Yes, Pharaoh, your nation is below, in some way, this nation that you've enslaved. It's the wrong way. Not that they're going to enslave anybody. So Israel then is to become a model of righteousness that the others are to learn from. That's almost where we're going to leave off. Everyone remembers the demand from the Charlton Heston movie, right? The 10 Commandments, Or the Prince of Egypt, for those of us who have watched that one too, the cartoon version of the story of the Exodus. It's equally good, though. It's very, very good. What does he say? Let my people go. Everybody says, that's what Moses was told to tell Pharaoh. Let my people go. Because he does eventually say that to him. However, that was not actually what he was told to ask for first. And this, again, nobody knows this, but you will in about 2 minutes or less, because it's 8 minutes after 11. The first demand was actually much simpler. After 400 years of being slaves, so no rest. Slaves don't get a day off. You know that. They don't get paid and they don't get a day off. After they have not had a Sabbath in 400 years. And that is that first gift that God gives to us as human race, the Sabbath rest, which foreshadows our eternal rest in heaven. This is a simple and reasonable demand. You go in there and you tell the Pharaoh this: our God, who we serve, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has asked for a 3-day journey into the wilderness for his people. 1 day of worship or a Sabbath rest, and then 3-day journey back. So how many days is that altogether? 7. 3 out, 1 Sabbath, 3 back. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So they would leave on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday they would get there, Saturday the day of rest, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday they'll be back within a week. That's all we're asking after 400 years. 1 day of rest, 1 day of connecting with God. But if you refuse, I will slay your firstborn son, because they're my firstborn son, and you've enslaved them. Egypt could be God's child too, but only by God letting God's firstborn son serve him, thereby learning how to serve God by watching. Egypt would learn how to serve God by watching Israel. Israel as a nation would serve as the priest and mediate for all the rest of the nations of the world. God knew that Pharaoh wouldn't listen, though, and what comes next are the plagues. And I think that's where we'll start the next time, okay? But that's all they asked for. 1 week off for 1 day of rest after 400 years. No Sabbaths. All right, have a great day. All right, and thanks for coming. Thank you. I got to go back to school.